Welcome to this edition of Africa 360. We're the program that goes across the continent to bring you an authentic view on Africa. I'm Chris Mareleng. Do join me on Africa 360. In this week's show, lapdogs or watchdogs. Almost every African state has an office tasked with protecting the public interest and ensuring that your tax money benefits the country. But are these ombuds preventing government corruption, or are corrupt public officials given a free pass? On this week's edition of Africa 360, we talk to the men and women tasked with protecting the public. Do stay with us on our program, Africa 360. This week, Africa 360 comes to you from the African Ombudsman Summit, which was held in Johannesburg this year. The theme of this meeting is When the People Complain, Entrenching Good Governance and the Rule of Law in Africa. But our question this week is, who listens when they complain, and does it yield results? Africa 360's producer Lindsay Schutel asked exactly that question.
Watchdog or lapdog? Most African countries have independent monitors, but corruption in the public service is rife. And the people are sick of it. South Africa's public protector has heeded calls to investigate expenditure on President Jacob Zuma's private residence in Nkandla. And who could forget when Kenyans released a litter of pigs on the steps of Parliament? Symbolizing greed, citizens protested proposed increases in parliamentarian salaries. According to Transparency International, 90% of African states scored below 50 in the 2013 Corruption Perception Index. When the people complain, that's the call to action adopted by ombuds and monitors who met here at the summit in Johannesburg. The ombuds are certainly listening to the public, but who's listening to the ombuds? The frameworks and institutions exist to monitor the public service, but that doesn't mean governments are listening.
What really, I think, had been done in this summit is really taking forward what we've been doing over the last 50 years, trying to establish what are the essential attributes, and they now sitting down in Africa saying, okay, in our own context, what would be the essential things that we have? And once we've done that, we engage those who are in power and say, you know what, we need this institution. The correlation is clear that you couldn't do without it if you are serious, and it's actually in your own interest. But things often don't work in Africa, and I say this with all sense of responsibility, because we will do things and we drop them.
One of those almost abandoned projects was the African Peer Review Mechanism. Launched in 2003, it was the first of its kind, a voluntary monitoring tool that saw African states score each other's governance record. But 10 years later, interest has waned, and only Mozambique and South Africa bothered to submit their reports this year. Perhaps it's up to ombuds to use the blueprint of the APRM to ensure good governance.
There is a great overlap between what the peer review looks at, which is governance issues in a country, and what the mandate of the Ombudsman is to investigate. So there isn't, in my view, enough interaction between the two mechanisms or offices.
As ombuds return to their countries with new ideas, it's clear that there will be no results without political will. Lindsay Schutel, Johannesburg.
Well, joining me to help us understand a little bit more about the role and the functions of ombudsmen across the African continent, I'm now joined from the African Union Commission here by Mr. Okoko-Esseau, and also joining us is Advocate Thuli Madonsela from the Public Protector's Office here in South Africa, and also joining us from the Commission on Administrative Justice is Mr. Otiende, Amollo. Thank you so much for joining us on Africa 360. Let me start with you, Mr. Amollo. Why should we care about the work and the functions of ombudsmen across the African continent?
Thank you. I think the citizens of the various states in Africa should care about the work of the Ombudsman, because the Ombudsman is the internal governance mechanism that keeps the respective elected governments in check. it is the Ombudsman to whom people must complain when service delivery fails. And it is important, therefore, that people must know that it is not enough to lament or demonstrate, but when there are real issues, they must present it to the Ombudsman.
But it's very interesting that you say they're there to keep the governments in check. But Mr. Esseau, when we look at the concept of the Ombudsman, is there a shared and common value and indeed definition of what an Ombudsman should do and can do within the various states in Africa?
So I think that if you call it Ombudsman or Mediator, like in most Francophone country, I think at least the shared understanding is that between the citizen and the administration, the institution, you have an institution which mediating in receiving the complaint of the citizen and trying to engage with these institutions so that these complaint grievances can be redressed. I think that's the general view. This is, I can say it's shared throughout Africa. That's what I can say. Maybe Advocate Thuli can explain it better, maybe. But at least that's my understanding. It's a shared value, shared understanding.
But when we look at the African Union and indeed the member states who constitute this organization, they aren't really even shared and common values around democracy, good governance, or indeed human rights. So how on earth can we expect your organization to have an effective capacity and role in this matter?
Personally, I think there are shared values. When they put their names on these instruments, that is an acceptance that the minimum standards in those instruments are binding on them. If we look at this instrument on democracy, elections and governance, our countries signed that instrument. South Africa was one of the first 10, and it's now been operational since 2012. It's a very recent instrument. That says to me there's a commitment. But you're right that when it comes to understanding fully the implications of what you have committed yourself to, there's often a gap, and that's where the African Union, the Commission on Political Affairs comes in. They've invited us as IOMA to work with them, possibly with other organizations, to institutionalize those shared values so that people now understand, okay, signing this particular instrument means you have got to change your conduct.
Well, join us after the break as we continue our discussion on the work of ombudsmen across the African continent, and that's only on Africa 360. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is Africa 360. This week, we're looking into the work and the activities of ombudsmen across the African continent. And I'm joined by a distinguished panel of guests who represent an association of ombudsmen on the African continent. Let me start with you, Advocate Madonsela. Before we went to break, we were looking and questioning the real commitment of African leaders to instituting and creating organizations that place our leaders and bring them to account and make governance more transparent and accountable. Are you happy at the process and indeed efforts to make our leaders more accountable?
I'm very happy. I was actually encouraged that leaders in Africa adopted this instrument in 2011 on governance and democracy and elections, and it came into operation in 2012. There's still a gap, of course, between practice and commitment, but it doesn't mean that there's no commitment. It just means that people always default to their comfort zone, whatever they have been doing. The challenge is now to assist them to conform their actions with the commitment.
Now, Mr. Esseau, one of the interesting things is that at an intellectual level on the African continent, many of our leaders are questioning the efficacy of pushing good governance when the real need of many of our African countries is effective governance. They argue that we don't have to comply to many of these rules and these legislative instruments that the African unions and the Ombudsman may push. What the people want is delivery of services. It doesn't have to be done in an open and accountable fashion, does it?
No, first of all, I think I would like to correct one or two things. It is not because there are some problems in implementing the shared values that there is no commitment on the side of our leaders. Because most of these instruments are legal instruments, they are treaties. They are being negotiated by member states. And when it is adopted by the assembly, it means that all our leaders agree, are committed to implement these
But with due respect, Mr. Esseau, what we effectively see are declarations like the Harare Declaration that talks about democracy and good governance. But what we experience as African citizens is a dearth. Surely you should be calling on our African leaders to do better.
Yes, it's because that the African leaders themselves, they know that we need to improve governance, to improve development, to improve public service delivery. That's why the African leaders have related the APRM, which is an African system of assessing governance, with the NEPAD program. And African leaders know very well, and they agree on that. They share that vision, which is even reflected in our 2063 agenda, that we need governance to deliver on development and on durable peace. This is a view shared by all leaders, in spite of problems that we can face in implementing this.
So, Advocate Amollo, a view shared by all leaders, do you really believe this? Do you also believe that there is a shared common political will towards achieving what IOMA is trying to do on the African continent?
I think I would say two things. First, in fairness to the AU, in recent times we have seen a shift in terms of focus from an OAU that was obsessed with sovereignty and all other issues, human rights, misgovernance, were internal issues, to an AU that recognizes that talking about development is not enough. There must be mechanisms of peer review, of looking at human rights and looking at issues of governance. So even at the continental level, it is clear that there's a shift. Now, where the Ombudsman comes in is because there are still those governments that regard any external view in terms of their performance as perhaps a view to destabilize the government from a foreign entity or from an NGO. But the Ombudsman is an internal institution within the state agency itself. And therefore, it has the ability and a voice that anybody externally might not have. And that is why, in the last decade or so, we have seen a growth of the institution of the Ombudsman, and now it's in 41 out of the 54 African states. Now that demonstrates that the governments have recognized that you must be accountable to the people through good governance.
Advocate Madonsela, you more than many other people know the consequences and the difficulty of making leaders more accountable to the people. Do you believe that on the African continent, given some of the political challenges, the difficulties where we see executives trying to impose their will on ombudsmen and people who hold similar offices, that we can get to a stage where others on the continent can experience the kind of service delivery that you offer here in South Africa?
Certainly, where there's a will, there's a way. And I would like to agree with my colleagues, Ms. Advocate Amollo and Mr. Okoko-Esseau, that the AU has already demonstrated willingness, and our leaders, because they're part of that AU, have demonstrated willingness. Where we're all stuck now is moving from where we are to where we want to be. Because the reason you come up with an instrument is because you acknowledge there's a problem. And if you read that governance one, the one they adopted in 2011, they spoke about the Arab Spring and how people had taken to the streets and taken things into their own hands because of bad governance, maladministration, etc. Obviously, then it takes time to move from where you are to where you should be, and those are the difficulties we experience. But it's not all doom and gloom. Just the other day, yesterday literally, I got a letter from one of our provinces here in Mpumalanga on one of those difficult reports, Pilgrim's Rest, saying we accept your findings fully, we accept the remedial action, we will be submitting an action plan shortly. And the idea is to publicize those stories of leaders who are willing to be corrected by these internal governance mechanisms, and happy to then change their ways for their own good and for the good of the people.
We should have common guidelines around what constitutes maladministration, what constitutes effective public service. It would effectively be like turkeys voting for Christmas. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is Africa 360. This week we're looking into the work of ombudsmen across the African continent. This is as they hold their annual summit here in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm joined by a distinguished panel of people in the Ombudsman sector and indeed from the Office of the Public Protector here in South Africa, and of course a guest from the African Union. Mr. or Advocate Amollo, one of the things is that if such a dispensation, the one that is being advocated to by two of your colleagues here, that we should have minimum standards, that we should have common guidelines around what constitutes maladministration, what constitutes effective public service, it would effectively be like turkeys voting for Christmas, because the very same people who would be subject to your oversight would now feel the effect of law of organizations like yours.
Interesting analogy, but not quite correct. It's not quite correct because there are two levels. One is that we recognize that the style of establishment of ombudsmen across Africa is slightly different. There are offices that bring together anti-corruption, human rights, and ombudsman together. There are some that are separate. And on that, we leave it to each individual country. But having done so, there's a mechanisms. By and large, as we continue, ombudsmen are being recognized as making what we call quasi-judicial decisions. That is, whatever findings the ombudsman comes up with, it is binding on you as a public office to implement. And to that extent, it's not just a wish list or the kind of thing the preacher will tell you in church and you choose to follow. No, there's an obligation to follow it. But beyond that, we are also now urging at the African Union level to start having an accountability mechanisms by which even the respective governments will be held accountable to the very standards they had already passed. Now, who better to know the minimum standards than those who are wearing the shoes? That is why we are coming up with those minimum standards.
Here's something that must concern you, and a lot of criticism that has been placed on a lot of ombudsmen, which is the fact that there seems to be a preponderance of focus on the public sector. But increasingly, as Africa becomes industrialized, integrated into the global economy, we see a lot of private institutions organizing and indeed having activities in Africa where they act with impunity because they have the money.
Yes, I think that, thank you for that question. I think this depends also on the, it should be part of the independence also of the ombudsman institution, because nothing prevent them from dealing with all these injustices, all these problems created by the private sector. So I think it depends on them also to be more creative, because when you look at some of the problems which are created in relationship with the public sector, sometimes they relate to economic and social rights. So if ombudsmen and mediators, they are there to try to remedy the problem that the citizens are facing, they should be able to deal with it.
I ask you this question, sir, specifically because there was a recent United Nations report that looked at the exploitation of resources in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why wasn't the government of the DRC able itself to engage in effective oversight investigations and possible prosecutions against these individuals?
Yes, okay. I think that, I mean, recently there have been a report in DRC where they have shown that there were some sectors where the government were not doing well in mining all these things. So it seems that based on this report from UN, there have been some measures taken, and now people can see the result of these measures. But I can say that we don't have any sign that the government of DRC have not taken seriously this report. We don't have any sign of that. But when UN published this report, I know that it created some debate in DRC between the executive and the parliamentary. I guess that from this debate, some measures have been taken by the government to try to correct.
Advocate Madonsela, do you have something to say about this also?
Certainly. I wanted to say that if there's no action, an ombudsman that has the power to take their own initiative could actually ask government questions. And that's where sometimes governments don't understand that if the Constitution gives you power to investigate without a complaint, you may ask questions. In this particular case, I also wouldn't comment on any specific country. I would say, but if there's an ombudsman who says nothing has happened, they can do so. If there's a Human Rights Commission or an ombudsman that has a bilateral mandate that includes maladministration and human rights, they too could investigate.
Advocate Amollo, in conclusion, we've also seen your Commission on Administrative Justice having to deal with questions by the public, for example, around the salaries of parliamentarians. What we effectively saw was a protest on the streets of Kenya where people released a litter of piglets and spilt blood on the floor to actually show that they were unhappy about that. Can you give us an example of how you specifically have dealt with such questions raised by the public?
I think to answer that question, it's important to put the Ombudsman Office in the context of other oversight bodies. A recent feature of most constitutions in Africa and governance structure is that within government there must be oversight institutions for specific areas. In the question of salaries, for example, including for members of parliament, there's a commission that is supposed to set that salary. The Ombudsman comes in specific terms, in terms of maladministration, but the Ombudsman also comes in if other agencies that are supposed to regulate a given area do not come in. So to come back to the question you asked, Mr. Esseau, for example, is that the Ombudsman would not deal with the private sector, but the Ombudsman can ask the regulator of that particular area why they have not dealt with the particular issue and ask them how, and to give a report on what they've done. In our case, therefore, the question, for example, of the salary of members of parliament, fortunately was not directly for us, it was for another oversight institution. But because citizens use the Ombudsman Office and sometimes they also use the judiciary, in proper cases, sometimes we ourselves join the cases to urge as a friend of the court, so that the court can make a determination that is better for the people rather than for the private entity.
Well, as we bring the show to an end, I think one of the lessons that we might learn here is from you, Advocate Madonsela. There is always this contending tension between the concept of secrecy and accountability. All states, we are aware, have the right under the framework of national security and other such measures not to disclose certain aspects. What can you tell us in terms of your experience in South Africa on how others can deal with these two contending perspectives?
It is a natural tension because obviously for the state to function, there has to be a level of protection of information. However, it is a tension that has to be managed. And we have seen here in South Africa when the Protection of State Information Bill was about to be passed, there was a debate around how far shall it go in protecting state information in a manner that does not undermine the fact that we have committed ourselves to open democracy. And that, I think, now has been resolved to some extent, but we'll see how the president deals with it.
Thank you so much for joining us here on Africa 360. I'm sure if you had a bit more time, we could look a little bit more into the work of ombudsmen across the African continent. Well, if you'd like to comment on this week's edition of Africa 360, you can certainly do so by joining us on Facebook. You can also send us your comments on Twitter. And of course, you can also send us an email on africa360@enca.com. And remember, you are the voice of Africa, and we always like to hear your views. So until next time, when we look forward to bringing you Africa like you've never seen it before, do take care.